The Allens and Brandons, breaking ground in frontier Illinois from 1830 to 1860. Before the middle of the 19th century, more than 175 years ago, two of our ancestor families, the Allens and Brandons, were the first in our family to leave the eastern states of New York and Pennsylvania for the frontier Middle West. Coincidentally, both ancestor families moved to within 70 miles of one another, to the west central part of the new state of Illinois. Less than 10 years before their arrival, Native Americans roamed these lands. What lured these two pioneer families to such unsettled areas of the country? Why would they leave regions where their families had lived for generations to start all over in risky enterprises in a barren region where they could lose everything, including their lives? During this brief presentation, we will probe the stories of the Allens and Brandon individuals and drop them into the context of the major economic and social forces that drove them west. You'll recall that the Allen family tree traces back from Ami L. Allen to Amariah Frost Allen and Mary Brewster, to his father, also Amariah Frost Allen, and Cynthia Ladd, to Chapin Allen and Mary Polly Frost. And here's the Brandon family tree, reaching back to Rodney Brandon, to Galbraith Lynn Brandon and Narcissa Lee Smith, to Richard Rick Brown Brandon and Magdalena Lena Mary Favorite. You'll recall that in February 2018 in Indiana, the Jack Allen sons explored Rodney Brandon's story back through Lynn and Narcy Smith's line, as well as Dudley Chase Smith. That's a separate presentation. This version of the Allen and Brandon family trees lines up the members of the two trees by decades, with the 1830s through the 60s highlighted. That's our current focus. Also take note that both of these families lived during the shift in political eras marked by first Thomas Jefferson and then by Andrew Jackson, which we'll explain further soon. Beginning now with the Allen tree, we are reaching back to Chapin and Polly, our grandfather Ami's great-grandfather, born in 1790. In 1839, Chapin Allen, not quite 50 years old, lived on a modest farm in Framingham, Massachusetts, 20 miles west of Boston. There's Framingham. In 1830, Framingham wasn't large enough to be included in the census. Locals provided handmade crafts for sale in the nearby markets. For decades in the early 1800s, many families were able to support themselves and neighbors in their village industries. They milled grains, sewed clothes and lace, made blankets and looms, cut trees to construct homes and furniture. They farmed small crops like grains or fruit, harvested grapes for wine and hops for beer, and kept cows and goats for their daily products. However, by 1825, competition and industrializing methods grew among the fast-growing populations in the Boston area. For the decades ahead, the family knew that Framingham was economically a dead end. The land was limited in its potential, and nearby Boston's industrial growth increasingly hampered any rural family's sustainable future. One option for residents was to go to work in the large mills or factories closer to Boston, but conditions there were low-paying, filthy, and unsafe. More about this situation later. In contrast to the industrialization in the East, promising opportunities existed west of the Appalachians. Americans have always been restless. The desire to go west increased dramatically after 1830 by a combination of influences which can be grouped into several broad categories. Each of these affected Chapin Allen's leap of faith. Another factor influencing Western expansion was the news spread throughout the East and Europe that land in Illinois was as attractive and fertile as any in the frontier U.S. The Englishman Robert Owen was enormously important in the development of the American frontier. He visited the heartland and both wrote and spoke publicly about the opportunities available for a new start for urban and rural families. He was responsible for the Harmony communities. Alexis de Tocqueville published his landmark account of democracy in America. After his visit in 1831, he admired the Americans for their unique emergence of individualism, self-interest, and materialism. Their enormous drive to make the most of their lives minimized the risks involved in leaving the security of their homes and venturing into wilderness regions like Illinois. Historians later characterized this phenomenon as manifest destiny. This obsession with claiming land that wasn't rightfully one's own was the essential force behind the development of the Western territories. Of course, it also created enormous injustices for those Native Americans who had lived on the land for generations. More about this clash of cultures later. Another influence opening up opportunities in the frontier stemmed from the rapid development of various transportation modes that were available, safe, and affordable. In particular, steam paddle wheelers on the major rivers and lakes provided frequent bookings for settlers. Easterners like Chapin Allen sold their farms and dreamed that they could rebuild their lives on the prairie frontiers. The Erie Canal or National Road and the Ohio-Mississippi River systems were especially notable options. This was decades before the building of the railroads. The radical growth of America during these decades was not entirely successful or prosperous. The simultaneous growth of industrialization in the East and the development of opportunities in the West maxed out America's ability to sustain its infrastructure and expansion. The young nation's economy suffered a big retrenchment. As one example of the rapid economic development of the upper Midwest, consider the forestry business. Timber was in high demand for homes and businesses for the arriving pioneers. Illinois was once 42% forested before the pioneers arrived. Today it is only 12% forested. To move men into the forested areas and move the timber to markets, large and numerous steamboats needed to be built and activated. That called for investors and governmental subsidies, but they were already tapped out, building infrastructures like the Erie Canal and the National Road. By the middle 1830s, beginning in the eastern states, there was a panic in the big banks, and its withering results swept quickly over the entire country, including the western lands. The Depression in Illinois, which lasted 5 years from 1837 to 1842, was perhaps the darkest in the state's entire history, even to this day. Thousands of acres of land had been purchased by the settlers, and payments were regularly falling behind. Pioneers like Chapin Allen were extremely cautious about taking the leap of faith and starting over in the West. After successfully selling his farm, he chose to move to Jacksonville, Illinois. From 1830 to 34, the U.S. government had established Illinois College in rural Jacksonville, Illinois. During those 4 years, the population of the town grew from 13,000 to 23,000, a 75% growth rate. Pioneers flocked there to learn practical methods for surviving in the frontier, such as farming, mining, lumberjacking, carpentry, and starting a small business catering to the influx of pioneers. Despite the fact that the financial panic had hit the Boston area by 1840, Chapin Allen was able to sell the Framingham farm a year later. He used the proceeds to buy property in Jacksonville, Illinois. He came with his 20-something-year-old son, Amariah Frost Allen. It's still unclear what Chapin chose to do in this new land. In some references about him, he's listed as a doctor, which at that time could have meant anything from a physician to a dentist to a veterinarian to a professor. The term was loosely controlled in the frontier 1830s. Young Amariah chose a different path. In 1844, Amariah Allen bought Lot 69 in the heart of Jacksonville from his father Chapin. Notice his new outfit, his hat and full business attire. It looked like they were just purchased. Within a year, he married Cynthia Hastings Ladd from the northern side of Boston. She was later referred to as a pioneer bride on the back of this photo, which looks retouched to set off her blue eyes. For many young women in the East, marrying an ambitious young man in the frontier looked promising, considering the limitations and deprivations that existed in the East. However, think for a moment about the bravery and determination it took for a young woman to agree to come to the outermost reaches of civilization to marry, start a home, and a family. Both Amariah and Cynthia faced enormous risks together. During the 1840s, Fort Madison, Iowa, was a town where an entrepreneur could capitalize on the rapid growth of the frontier. Fort Madison was a steamboat ride away from Jacksonville, Illinois. By 1845, Fort Madison was a third the size of Chicago. It served as a gateway on the Mississippi to many thousands of immigrants from the eastern states who sought better opportunities in the new lands opening up in Iowa and the more easterly territories. Fort Madison was a typical bustling frontier town. Within a year of his marriage, Amariah sold his property in Jacksonville and invested with a partner in a dry goods store in Fort Madison, Iowa. But his prospects evaporated within a year. The store opened in April of 1845. By August of 1846, he was dead from an outbreak of cholera. By October of that year, his son was born to Cynthia back in Jacksonville. She almost lost the baby as well as her own life, according to the doctor who took her under his care. But she pulled through. She gave the newborn the name of his father, Amariah Frost Allen. But in addition to her grief, she was most likely destitute. Wives were totally dependent upon their husbands for their security, and everything her dead husband owned had been invested in his enterprise, now lost. Fortunately, she would be cared for by her father-in-law, Chapin, who still owned property in Jacksonville. Cynthia, a true survivor, had moved within 3 years to Shoalsburg, Wisconsin, with her infant son. Shoalsburg prospered from the still active lead and zinc mines in the Little Switzerland region of Wisconsin, northwest of Galena, Illinois. Cynthia married John K. Williams, who had a son by a previous marriage. That's young Amariah on the right. He grew up and eventually learned the banking business from his father. Amariah married Mary Brewster, a descendant of the elder William Brewster of Mayflower and Plymouth Colony fame. The Allens moved to Iowa, where Amariah Lewis Allen was born. He too learned banking from his father before he taught animal husbandry. Back in Jacksonville, Dr. Chapin Allen made his living. At one point, he went to live in Quincy, Illinois, over on the border of the Mississippi River, where one of his married daughters lived. I tracked down this grave, but it wasn't easy. This is all that's left of his gravestone, a casualty of reckless groundskeeping. But the site is a gorgeous location on the bluff above the Mississippi River. Chapin had spent only 10 years in Illinois, but to live 59 years was a respectable span of time in those days, especially in the frontier. Okay, let's switch now to the other half of the story. The Brandon family's arrival into Illinois in the 1830s was very similar to the Allens, with a few key differences. The second half of this presentation corresponds with the bottom portion of this family timeline, with the Brandons, tracing back to Richard Rick Magdalena Lena Brandon, their son Galbraith Lynn, and Narcissa Smith, as well as Rodney and Harriet Lane. The Brandons originally had farms in Adams County, Pennsylvania, since at least the Revolutionary War in the late 1700s. The area had been settled by mostly Scots-Irish immigrants, like the Brandons. If you've ever visited or seen pictures of the Gettysburg Civil War battlefield, you can imagine the remote character of the place, with rolling hills and forests which, because of the battlefield park, has been preserved today. In 1836, the young Brandon family was still in Adams County, but they soon moved along the national road to rural Macomb, Illinois, where their third son, Galbraith Lynn Brandon, was born in 1839. This is the original letter from Lena's father citing the birth of their son Lynn. That's Lena in the background. Her father spelled his name according to his French-German origins, but she Americanized the spelling. Within 10 years, in 1845, the Brandon family bought a farm in Fountain Green, Hancock County, the county adjacent to their first farm in McDonough County. Incidentally, the Justice of the Peace who notarized the deed is not the Abraham Lincoln, but a nephew whose father lived in Hancock County. Presidential candidate Abe Lincoln would visit this family in Hancock County during his political campaign. Before we proceed with the Brandon story, it's important to once again pull back and look at the historical context. Picking up on the earlier comments about Andrew Jackson's influence on the early development of the U.S., between his involvement in the War of 1812 and when he became president in 1828, he was the primary force between an early 19th century political philosophy that espoused greater democracy for the, quote, common man, as the Jackson Democrats defined that term. It became the nation's dominant political worldview for a generation. In national terms, these Jacksonians favored geographical expansion, justifying it in terms of what they called manifest destiny. Jackson's so-called common man was largely limited to Americans of European descent, and voting rights were extended to adult white males only. Armed with this trumped-up justification, the term is used here advisedly because President Donald Trump is often compared to Andrew Jackson, the rights of Native Americans were swept aside, along with their property. African Americans suffered similar abuses until the Civil War helped to reshape their future. Regrettably, the rights of the Native Americans remained unresolved, even to this day. To give you an idea of the sweeping mass migration that occurred in the U.S., in 1830, there were 13 million Americans in the country, and by 1840, 4.5 million of them, or 35% of the population a decade before, had crossed the Appalachians into the Mississippi Valley. On the left is Andrew Jackson. On the right is Chief Black Hawk. 2 decades after Jackson began his land grab along the frontier regions of the fledgling United States, and soon after his Trail of Tears expulsion of the Native Americans to Oklahoma, his attention centered upon the Indians in Illinois. In 1832, the Sac and the Fox tribes fought under the leadership of Black Hawk, but these tribes were soon pushed across the Mississippi River, opening the region to white settlement. Batavia was founded the next year, in 1833. The rapid growth of the western region of Illinois was partially due to the awarding of military tracts or bounty lands to veterans of the War of 1812. From the federal government's perspective, the newly vacated land in Illinois needed to be populated by white settlers after the Indians were pushed westward. The veterans of the previous War of 1812, most of whom lived in the East, had been granted the free land as bounty, but most of them did not care to live in the frontier. So they sold it to any buyers who did. The Brandons had not fought in the war, but it's likely that they did buy Illinois bounty lands from veterans at favorable prices. And the lands in Hancock County were put to splendid use by the Brandon farming family. Let's review the importance of inland transportation routes again because it had a direct impact on the Brandons. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened, allowing traffic into the entire Great Lakes system and the upper Middle West. Once steamboats replaced most flatboats, commerce exploded. For instance, in 1830, the population of Chicago was 25 to 100 people. It looked like this early drawing. Notice that most of the figures are Native Americans. But by 1834, 100 settlers were arriving per day. By 1836, it was a major port with almost 500 vessels per day. Even though the Brandons came from the Boston area and could have traveled easily through the Great Lakes, they were farmers. It was wiser for them to travel by land with their oxen and farming equipment. The National Road was the first major improved highway in the United States, built by the federal government. Initially begun east of the Appalachians as early as 1811, the 620-mile road connected the Potomac and Ohio rivers and was a main transport path to the west for thousands of settlers. It was reinforced in the 1830s, which benefited the Brandons directly. After the financial panic of 1837 and the resulting economic panic, congressional funding ran dry, and construction was stopped at Vandalia, Illinois, just 50 miles short of where the Brandons settled. Many travelers from New England found easier access through lakes in Chicago than over the land or by the Ohio River. But many farmers, like the Brandons, whose farm in Pennsylvania was very near the National Road, brought their oxen with them, so they probably came by that overland route. It's worth noting that there was one major group that came in large numbers to Hancock County. Joseph Smith and the Mormons settled in Nauvoo, Illinois. By 1842, their numbers rose as high as 16,000 believers, making it nearly as large as St. Louis and 3 times larger than Chicago. Their cabins were probably similar to the ones first built by the Brandons when they arrived in the area slightly earlier. The Mormons built the temple, which is recently restored. But within another few years, by 1846, a militia organized among the non-Mormon residents of Hancock County led to armed clashes and the lynching of Joseph Smith. The jail where he had been held is still there. After Smith's execution, the Mormons began their long exodus to Utah under Brigham Young. After much research into those locals involved in these clashes, it appears that the Brandons were not involved. They were likely too busy tending to their large farm. 30 miles east of Nauvoo, near Fountain Green, Illinois, the Brandons prospered on their farm for 15 years. Rick and Lena had another 8 children and expanded their farm property. Other residents moved into the Hancock County area. They built a mill, a school, a public house, and a church, as shown on this map from 1874. In 1840, the town was more forest than field, so the Brandons had cleared a lot of land before they were able to farm it. Here's an example of the interior of a typical frontier home during the 1830s to 60s. They would cook meals in the fireplace in iron kettles and griddles. They would make their own butter, spin threads for clothing and rugs, make their own candles, and construct their own homes and furniture from the nearby forest. Farm implements were crude. On the left are seed planters. Notice how they would spread the ground open and drop the seeds down from the crude canisters. Imagine how long it would take to sow an entire field this way. On the right is a small saw with a handle made out of the horn from a cow. Remember, much of the land needed to be cleared of trees before they could farm it. It's no wonder the Brandons had 11 children to help keep the farm. Sadly, in his 20th year of farming in Illinois, Father Rick Brandon traveled to Iowa City to visit a brother's family. There he caught cholera from one of the children and died within 3 days. He was only 45 years old. Lena brought his body back to Fountain Green in a lovely cemetery looking over the fertile fields of Hancock County. Lena described her life after her husband's death a lonely situation and earthly loss. Incidentally, Rick died of cholera 8 years after Amariah Allen had died of the same disease in Fort Madison, Iowa. During the period between their two deaths from 1846 to 54, scientists in Europe had determined that cholera was spread through water infected with sewage, intensified when people lived close to their livestock. But these advanced medical findings, due to the invention of the microscope, took a long time to reach around the world to settlers in Iowa's bustling frontier towns where proper sanitary methods were still primitive and disregarded. These treasures are recent pictures from what's left of the Brandon farm. This park-like setting stands in stark contrast to the stretches of prairie land going for miles in every direction. Is it possible that the Brandons were trying to recreate the rolling scenes that they remembered from Adams County, Pennsylvania? They must have labored hard over the years to dam up the creek running through their farm, creating this lovely pond and stream. Do you suppose they built the old bench on the lower right from rims from a tractor? Imagine them sitting on the bench after a long day in the adjoining fields, enjoying the view of their self-made Eden. There are no longer any signs of their house, but the freshwater well still works according to the current owners, who keep the ground well tended. We fast forward briefly in order to track the story of Rodney Brandon's father, Lynn. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, 3 Brandon brothers signed up right away. They were abolitionists of the deepest hue. Hancock County was a stronghold of the freeing of slaves. By 1863, several Brandons fought in the siege of Vicksburg, General Grant's first big triumph of the war. By 1865, 25-year-old Lynn was allowed to leave the farm to fight during the final 6 months of the war. Unfortunately, he was a victim of mustard gas, which compromised his breathing for the rest of his life. Lynn, after returning to his family farm for 5 years in Hancock County, Illinois, moved to Blue Springs Community in Monroe County, Indiana, near Bloomington. It was a Robert Owen Harmonist community. There, Lynn claimed the bounty land he was entitled to as a Civil War veteran. He farmed the land and soon married the community school teacher, Narcissa Lee Smith, who gave birth to 2 sons, Fred and Rodney. That's Rodney Brandon on the right in Narcissa's lap. One footnote about Lena Brandon back in Fountain Green in Illinois. In 1872, when the local Presbyterians wanted to build a new church, they received a gift of 75 acres of farmland from Lena, which helped build this church in Fountain Green. It's still there and active. One related family anecdote. In a further amazing coincidence, West Central Illinois was also where the Davis family of ancestors arrived less than 2 decades after the Allens and Brandons. In 1856, Albion Keziah Davis came from Maine to Clinton County, Iowa, where he farmed for 5 years. This location is about a day's horse ride from Hancock County, where the Brandons were still farming. He then returned to Maine and married Octavia Shellis. A later photograph of Octavia shows that her left eye crosses toward the center. This earlier photograph was badly retouched to disguise the misalignment, perhaps to help her find a husband like Albion. In 1875, Albion returned to eastern Iowa to live in Marion, just north of Cedar Rapids. By then, he was a leader of work gangs that helped build the frontier's new railroad system. By 1913, his granddaughter, Esther Davis, had met and married Amariah Lewis Allen. It isn't easy summarizing such a sweeping and diverse set of family chronicles. It was a strange coincidence that both the Allens and Brandons arrived in the same remote parts of the frontier U.S. during the same decade of the 1830s. But there's certainly more to their story than mere chance. Genealogists say that to know yourself, know your ancestors. Of course, we can read too much into the influence of those who came before us, especially if we're reaching back almost 200 years. Today, we might learn something about ourselves as we wonder, how did they manage? How did they survive such enormous risks? But if we had been there back then and asked any of those Allens or Brandons to tell their own stories, they wouldn't have thought that they were very different from thousands of pioneers in their midst. But that large group of pioneers were special. You'll recall that Alexis de Tocqueville admired Americans for their unique individualism and their enormous drive to make the most of their lives. These rare human qualities, which combined with the many socioeconomic dynamics that opened up the Midwest at that time, built our country into what the world still regards as the most enterprising republic ever known. So, wherever any of us live today, may these stories make us think of those pioneers who dared to break ground for our benefit and honor them.